Gentlemen, welcome to the New York Center for Foreign Policy Analysis webinar. Today, on May 15th, 2020, we have some honored guests from around the world, right here in Washington, D.C., also from Sana'a in Yemen, and in London. We're really pleased to have the following honored experts on a critical country in the MENA region of the world, as we are in severe COVID conditions globally. We also have a series of conflicts, small wars, larger wars, that continue in spite of this raging virus. But let me introduce myself and the speakers, and then we will get into some extraordinary developments in Yemen. Dr. Jeffrey Stacy, to be at the State Department and now been pitching a hand at the New York Center for Foreign Policy Analysis. We're pleased to welcome also in Washington, Ahmed Naji Abdullah from the Carnegie Endowment. We have Osama El Faki from the Twana Center for Human Rights in Yemen, Rafat El Khali from Deep Root Consulting in London. So Yemen, ladies and gentlemen, you're probably quite aware, is one of the countries where not only the virus is raging, but so is warfare. And in this day and age, when we have a very active UN Secretary General and a United Nations system, all of this is of acute concern to Secretary General Guterres. 2 months ago, he issued a call for global cessation of violence in COVID-19 conditions. And some of the most interesting developments in response to this have taken place in the country of Yemen. So we're going to today start with an overview of the geopolitics and the rather recent developments in terms of the UN local efforts, the SRSG working there on bringing the different combatants to the peace table, starting with a ceasefire potentially. Then we will proceed to lay out some of the severe challenges related to COVID in this country of 30 million that is one of the world's poorest. And then the all-important topic to gather some of us today is the human rights situation and the various aspects that we find Yemen and those intervening in Yemen, both responsible for and victims of. So let's start with Rafat Al-Khali, who would help us sort of understand some of the dynamics of the conflict. And of course, we're looking forward to questions and potentially some answers in today's session. So Rafat, over to you, please.
Thank you, Jeff. Sorry, the mute was not taken off. And thanks for everyone who's joining us today to discuss what's happening in Yemen. And I just thought I'd start with a few points on where the peace process is currently. And I'm sure everyone who's following Yemen is seeing how the peace process is pretty much in a standstill. Ever since the last round, which was the consultations in Sweden in December 2018. It's been almost a year and a half now with no formal round of negotiations or consultations bringing together the two sides of the two main sides, I should say, of the conflict. We've heard just 2 days ago from the special envoy in his statement to the Security Council that he remains optimistic that there is positive response to the initiative that he put to the two parties, which is mostly based on 3 points. One is a ceasefire, and two is a number of economic and humanitarian measures to be taken. And three is the resumption of the political process. Despite his optimism, the fact is it's been at least as I mentioned, a year and a half, but also since March, when he began developing this initiative, and April as well, that we haven't seen any real progress. And despite the ceasefire announced by Saudi Arabia as leader of the coalition, we have seen an escalation still of the conflict in multiple fronts, and a continuation of both sides, the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition, in their military operations in different fronts. So, to say the least, there is no sign of positive developments in the UN-led peace process. There is a catch-22 that the peace process is stuck in, related to the South, and specifically the developments that happened in the South ever since August of last year, where the STC, and as part of the Riyadh agreement that was signed in November, was supposed to be brought into the government delegation for any upcoming peace process meetings. But because the Riyadh agreement has not been implemented, and the other steps did not take place yet, and it's facing actually escalations now in the south, in Abyan and in Aden, as of this whole month of Ramadan, the envoy and the UN could not actually go ahead with convening any formal meeting between the government and the Houthis, because it would, in effect, cause further escalations within the government STC agreement. So everyone has been waiting for the Riyadh agreement to take place first and to be implemented. And so a new delegation can be formed from the government, and then that new delegation can be part of the meetings with or the negotiations with the Houthis. And because
could you explain who the STC are, what that stands for, and what the Riyadh agreement consists of?
Yes, for sure. Sorry. So the STC is the Southern Transitional Council, which is a group that was announced and set up with the objective of regaining the independence of the South, largely funded and supported by the UAE. And in August, as I mentioned, already there was, before last August, an initial or they took over the new capital, the temporary capital in Aden, and the government fled. And after that, they went into negotiations convened by the Saudi leadership in Riyadh, and the Riyadh agreement was signed. And the objective of the agreement was to bring the STC into the fold of the government, and so for them to be part of the newly formed government, for there to be changes in the governors and security commanders in Aden and in other southern governorates, and to also ensure that the STC, as I mentioned, becomes part of the government delegation to the peace process. There is, of course, many military elements of the Riyadh agreement that dictates how the different forces should be moved or withdrawn or redistributed. And so the Riyadh agreement signed in November had an actual very ambitious timeline of all the steps being implemented within 2 months. So now we are talking since November, almost 6 months. And it doesn't seem that it's going anywhere. And this month, as I mentioned, there was a further escalation with the STC announcing self-administration of the South, as they said, although their control does not extend across all the governorates in the South. But at least in Aden, in the seat of the government, the temporary seat of the government, they have taken control there. So right now, it doesn't seem that the Riyadh agreement is going anywhere, although there is now talks about further mediations by Saudi to try and push it forward. But until that peace is resolved, the formal peace process, especially the political aspect of it, is very difficult to see how it would proceed. And so what as I mentioned, the envoy tried to do is put on the table an initiative for a countrywide ceasefire that the coalition and the government and the Houthis would agree to, followed by, or in parallel with, economic and humanitarian measures such as easing any lockdowns around on the ports, perhaps Sana'a airport, and whether it would be allowed to reopen, some of the requirements on ships coming into Hodeidah, and some different economic and humanitarian measures. And for that to set the stage for the continuation of the political process. And I think the hope was by then that this Riyadh agreement and the issue of the STC would have been resolved. But it's all right now coming together in a very challenging and a negative way, in terms of no prospects currently for an actual implementation of the Riyadh agreement. No clear signs, despite, as I mentioned, optimism from the envoy and from some others, such as Oman making some statements. But on the ground, that did not translate yet to anything to show that there is an imminent agreement on ceasefire. In the south, the government and STC has actually went into an open military confrontation in Abiyan. And it's not clear where that is leading. So this is where overall the peace process is, and I think maybe we can hear more from Ahmed as well on the details of the local actors and where they stand today.
Rafat, thank you. This is one of the most extraordinarily complex conflicts that we have in the world today. Ahmed, would you take the baton and help us understand who some of these actors are, primarily domestic, but also maybe a few of the major interveners?
Yeah, I think, thank you so much first, and thank you, Rafat, for all these details. Just I want to add to what Rafat mentioned. I think what we are having in Yemen today is a sort of multi-layered conflict. So we have different external actors plus internal actors, and we have a sort of many conflicts inside the country belonging to those actors. So the common narrative about what's happening in Yemen is that Yemen is just a field of proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Yes, this is actually one of the, let's say, conflict chapters, but this is actually not the whole story. So we have in Yemen, Saudi Arabia versus Iran, and this is actually in the northern part of Yemen. Then we have Saudi Arabia and Oman in eastern part of the country. Then we have contradictory strategies between the UAE and Saudi Arabia in South Yemen, and perhaps this is the reason behind the emergence of the STC, the Southern Transitional Council. Then if we go down, if we go down to the internal actors, we have the Iranian-backed Ansar Allah, known as Houthis. Then we have the Hadi government forces. Then we have, as I mentioned, the STC. We have the Republican Guards, which is related to one of the former President Saleh's relative. Then which is supported also by the Emiratis. So all these actually internal actors are fighting each other, and they are also they have some links to the external actors, the regional actors. So this is actually one of the pattern of the conflict. It's hard to separate the external actors with the internal actors, because they became like aligned factions for all these regional actors. Then we have the international actors who are getting benefits from the situation in Yemen by selling weapons and other stuff. So this is actually the whole picture about the conflict. Speaking about why we don't find any progress in the peace process, I think there are lots of factors. Perhaps the key three of them. Most of the internal actors believe that this is unfinished business for them. This is an incomplete war. So they feel that to some extent they have some cards that can play on the ground before going to any negotiation table. This is the first one. The second, I think, there is a lack of willingness among them. And for some parties, war became like a business. I mean, now we are facing actually a war economy where so many warlords are getting lots of benefit from it. So for them, the worst case scenario is that if the war is ends. So this is actually one of the problems that we are facing. The third one, some people were, I mean, to some extent optimistic, including the UN envoy Martin Griffith about I mean, COVID-19 that will lead to some sort of de-escalation in the country. But what happened was totally different. We have seen lots of confrontations in many areas, including Al-Jawf, Marib, and Abiyan, as Ra'fat mentioned. And we have actually seen stubbornity actually among the internal actors to show any sort of flexibility towards the peace track. And this has actually led us to see another dimension of conflict, which is related to how the warring parties are looking at the civilians matters. So in fact, there is a big gap between the civilians' concerns and the warring parties' interest, and they don't show any sort of interest toward protecting people. For instance, in the last 3 years, the cholera outbreak, for instance, affected more than 2 million, according to so many international NGOs. And the question, did the warring parties stop conflict because of this huge and massive number? The answer is no. The conflict was continuing in many areas, and they give no attention to this humanitarian stuff.
Indeed, indeed. Well, thank you for giving us even a deeper picture. There are so many layers to this, and it's really a kaleidoscope of levels and vectors to this conflict, partly military, partly humanitarian, partly now health related. And we haven't even started on the human rights question. But Osama, could you help us transition more into some of the vulnerabilities that are more acute still now because of the arrival of the COVID-19 virus?
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to my colleagues Ahmed and Ra'fat for their input. I would like first to start with the general overview about the human rights situation in Yemen. Yemenis are not only suffering from violations, they also suffer from the warring parties undermining state institutions, particularly the coalition and the Ansar Allah armed group Houthis, including at the expense of rule of law, empowering different armed groups to seize control of different parts of Yemen. For Yemenis, 5 difficult years have passed since Ansar Allah armed groups, the Houthis, extended their control over the capital Sana'a in 2014, and the following intervention by the Saudi UAE-led coalition in support of the internationally recognized government of Yemen in 2015. The outcome today is obvious: a country torn apart and the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. All warring parties and authorities in Yemen still continue committing violations of international human rights and humanitarian law across Yemen. And these violations and abuses include airstrikes or ground attacks on civilians and civilian objects, including medical facilities, incidents of arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, denial of humanitarian aid. And also the warring sites and authorities also still continue undermining other rights and freedoms such as press freedom, rights to peaceful assembly, and violations against the rights of members of minorities like the Baha'is. In last March, Muwatana and Physicians for Human Rights released a report that documents 120 attacks on medical facilities and healthcare workers between March 2015 till December 2018. And the analysis reveals four main categories or violent attacks on health facilities that include airstrikes, ground attacks, military occupation, assaults on health workers, and other violations such as looting and restrictions on humanitarian aid. These attacks violated fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, and some of these attacks may amount to war crimes. Violations committed in Yemen is not only the responsibility of the warring sides and authorities, but also go beyond to include third states that support, sell, or provide weapons to the parties like Iran in the case of Houthis, or the US, UK, France, and other European states in the case of the Saudi UAE-led coalition. And in last December, we in Muwatana and our partners in some other organizations like European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights submitted a communication to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to investigate the legal responsibility of corporate and political actors from some European countries for complicity in alleged war crimes in Yemen. Regarding COVID-19, so far 108 confirmed cases, including 16 deaths in total, were announced by authorities in Aden and Sana'a. And now Aden experiences large number of deaths on a daily basis, not only because of COVID-19, but also because of other diseases apparently. And the internationally recognized government a few days ago announced Aden as an infested city. On the other hand, the Houthi-controlled Ministry of Health in Sana'a announced only 2 confirmed cases, and there are different reports indicate that the actual number is much higher. The public opinion is skeptical about the seriousness of Houthi authorities, and people believe that the authorities in Sana'a are not transparent about the real situation of COVID-19 in the Houthi-controlled areas. Therefore, the public health situation is very concerning, particularly with the poor infrastructure even before the armed conflict, and with the attacks of warring sides on the existing medical facilities and obstructing humanitarian aid. Mohammed Qahtan is one of the prominent political leaders who has been forcibly disappeared by Houthis since April 2015. There are hundreds of civilians who have been arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared by all warring parties, either in Sana'a or Ma'rib or Aden or other governorates. And given the fact that the conditions of detention centers in Yemen are really bad, and now Yemenis are facing COVID-19, there are urgent steps need to be taken by the warring sites and authorities to reduce the prisoners' population. And we believe that one of these steps is immediately releasing arbitrary detainees and disclose the fate of forcibly disappeared. Since September 2014, when Houthis took over the capital Sana'a, all warring parties have attacked and closed public spaces in different ways, and there are concerns of authorities and armed groups using COVID-19 response as a cover to commit abuses against freedom of expression peaceful assembly, for example. Um, in other recent developments regarding human rights, we have that the announcement of the head of Supreme Political Council in Sana'a, who announced in March to release the Baha'is from prisons, including Kamal Haidara, who was sentenced to death. There are at least 6 Baha'i members detained in Houthi prisons, but so far since the announcement, no one was released. And last month also the Houthi-controlled specialized criminal court sentenced 4 journalists to death and sentenced 6 others to imprisonment with time served. But since that date, in April, only 1 journalist was released, and there are calls on the Ansarullah armed group Houthis to overturn the death sentences. So yeah, I would like to stop here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Osama. These details are not widely known outside of Yemen, some of them that you've underlined. And not only, obviously, is it critically important that these human rights are preserved specifically on these detainees, the release that has been called for. Also, panelists, prospects for the international community to deliver aid through the port of Hodeidah. What is the situation there related to just the very latest conflict updates, and to what degree is UN Special Envoy Griffiths focused on both of these aspects as COVID cases are going rapidly upward? Osama, would you like to take that one some more?
Hi. I mean, it's very essential to keep the humanitarian aid getting in the country. There are some reports about some donors might withdraw from supporting humanitarian programs in Yemen, which is very critical, and we believe that it's very essential at this time, at this hard time, that the humanitarian programs continue in Yemen to support the Yemeni population. But it's also essential for all parties to the conflict to ensure that the humanitarian aid goes to those who are in need, and stop their violation, restrict people from the humanitarian aid or from the essential items that is important for their survival.
Indeed. Ahmed, could you jump in on this, if you would, please? And you turn your microphone on, please, Ahmed. No, we can't.
Okay. Okay, great. So speaking about Hodeidah, I think it's similar to the other areas in the northern part. The conflict there was posed based on a Stockholm Agreement, despite the fact that there are lots of clashes from time to time. But since Hodeidah is one of the poorest areas in the country, the community there are suffering a lot actually during this time. And this actually led us to speak about the other dimension of the pandemic, which is related to the economic situation. Perhaps Yemen have not, put any sort of precautions to fight COVID-19, But because of the precautions implemented, on the neighboring countries, Yemen have suffered lots of have suffered because of this matters, and we have seen in the last actually few months that so many people who are working in Saudi Arabia, for instance, which are more than 1 million Yemenis, they are actually at home without receiving any income, and this is actually make it very difficult for them actually. And this is actually another layer of disaster that we will face in upcoming month if the situation is still in this track. Speaking about how the warring parties are dealing with COVID-19, I think it's important to mention that they are trying to first disclose the number of cases in order to show that they are better than the other areas. And we have seen actually in the Houthi controlled areas where the Houthis try to say that we don't have any sort of COVID-19 like other areas, for instance, in Eden, and it's the problem of the government which don't implement strict measures on people who have this kind of pandemic. And at the same times, we have seen a sort of weaponizing the pandemic, because some warring parties are using the pandemic in order to say that, yeah, it's better to go and fight and be in a hero in the military fronts, better than dying at home because of the pandemic. This is actually one of the dimensions of using this pandemic. And the other thing, and I will stop here, the how the internal borders are getting affected by this pandemic, because now we have divided countries, divided places in the country. Every warring party is controlling just a specific area. So the pandemic just trigger a sort of security grip. So every warring party is trying to tighten this security grip in order to make its area far apart from the other area.
Highly unnerving. Rafat, could you help us maybe widen the lens a little bit? Osama, a few minutes ago, referred to even third parties, intervening powers being responsible even potentially for war crimes. What is happening with Saudi Arabia and Iran and the UAE, in addition to those external powers who are a little less involved, but primarily those? For example, after the Saudis declared this unilateral ceasefire that each of you has pointed out has not lasted, to what degree did the uptick in Houthi fighting and their success on the battlefield have to do with increased Iranian support right as the Saudis were backing off for a temporary period at least? Rafat, are you with us?
I think he lost internet connection, Jeff.
Okay, well, this is our new Zoom world. Ned, would you maybe say another word about that topic, because you were alluding to it as well?
I think, we have seen in the last few months that there is some sort of transformation in Saudi strategy towards Yemen, because after 5 years of conflict, they are convinced more than before that the military intervention in the country should be ended, and they are trying actually to come up with a new intervention strategy. That's why they are intensifying their connections with the Houthis through what the foreign minister of Saudi mentioned that it's back a channel, which is through Omanis, in order to reach a sort of understandings to secure their borders. And I think this move came as a result of the Aramco attack last year, because the main objective behind their intervention in Yemen was in 2015 is to secure their borders, and what they got in fact is more insecurity, especially after the Houthis started firing plastic missiles and using drone attacks, not just in southern part of Saudi Arabia, but also beyond this areas to the central parts of Saudi Arabia. So Saudis have been sending so many positive messages, and we can read the acceptance of ceasefire by Saudis in this track. So they are trying to say that, yeah, we are ready to move towards peace deal with the Houthis, and we can do lots of things in this regard. And if you just follow the news, the Saudis at the beginning announced that it's just 2 weeks 2 weeks ceasefire. Then they extended the ceasefire to the end of Ramadan. And despite the fact that the Houthis refused to accept this ceasefire, and they said that this is just a media maneuver, and we cannot actually accept this kind of move from Saudi Arabia because we didn't find anything on the ground. And in fact, the Houthis realized that there is a weak position that Saudi Arabia in nowadays, and they need more and more from Saudi Arabia. That's why on the same day that the Saudi announced the ceasefire, they published what they name it the national vision of ending aggression in Yemen, where the Houthis are trying to put themselves in the position of representative of whole Yemen. So they are requesting from Saudi Arabia to deal with them as a representative of Yemen, and they are another country. So in this sense, they can start negotiating with Saudi Arabia, which is, I think, very, very difficult for Saudi Arabia to move to this extent, because still we have another factions in the other areas in the country.
Fascinating. Rafat, are you back with us by chance? Okay. Well, you pointed, Ahmed, to some of the larger dynamics. And of course, we saw the mining of some of the shipping in and around the Persian Gulf even earlier, involving there were Houthi drones and accusations of Iranian mines and what have you. So, I mean, quite an extraordinary development that just as Martin Griffiths is putting a peace plan to the combatants, the Houthis are feeling understandably more powerful. They sense the weakness that you pointed to, the Saudis experiencing significant aspects of COVID inside their own country, inside their leadership even, and then remarkably, the Houthis going on the offensive and yet claiming to be dealt with as the legitimate representative of all of Yemen. But as you point out, the STC and others would beg to differ. And indeed, right away there, we saw an increased instance of fighting. So Osama, could you help us a little bit with understanding that even before the Saudis backed off, it was UAE that backed off to a degree. Yet you also pointed out just a little bit earlier that they're the primary supporters of the STC at the same time. How does that work?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, because the connection was not good?
Sure. So Ahmed was just referring to how the Saudis have, to a significant degree, declared and in varying ways stuck to this unilateral ceasefire. They declared, even extended it. And yet, even before that, months before, we had the UAE backing out of the Yemen conflict at large to also a significant degree. Yet, as you pointed out just a little while ago, they're the primary backer of the STC in the south, and now fighting, exerting control over Aden and fighting the Hadi-backed forces.
It's if I may say, it's more like a competition between Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. They are not necessarily fighting each other, but even before the announcement of UAE to withdraw from Yemen, since 2017, they have supported in establishment of some forces on the ground, like the security belts and the Hadrami elite forces and Shabani elite forces. These forces that are not directed by the internationally recognized government, and they are supported financially, and also they get their orders from the UAE. So the announcement of the UAE to withdraw from Yemen, I mean, it's not for me. It's not a big announcement, because their forces, the UAE proxy forces, are still there to do the work.
Yeah, I think I do agree with Osama, because and this is actually related to your question, Jeff, about why the Houthis seems to be more stronger after 5 years of conflict. I think the problem related to the Saudi-led coalition strategy, because if you remember at the beginning of this coalition in 2015, the number of countries participating in this coalition was 10 countries, then ended up with just 2 partners, which is Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And both of them actually have contradictory strategies. And they ended up actually fighting each other, not necessarily directly, but through their local factions. Until last year, when the Emiratis actually decided to leave the country by announcing a new strategy, which they call it a peace first strategy. And I don't think they totally withdrew from Yemen, because in fact they just withdrew some of their troops, and now they decided to count more on their local factions, as Osama mentioned. So whatever they want, they can do it through their local factions, because according to the Emirati officials, they have trained around 200,000 soldiers in Yemen, and they can do whatever they want through them. On the other side, actually, Saudis are aligned with the Hadi government, but with different actually approach, because talking about Hadi's government is something broad. I mean, we have different factions inside this government. So yes. Saudis actually are trying to work with people who are loyal to it and try to support them. And because of these divisions and deep divisions among the coalition, the Houthis, I think, found good space to advance. So they are actually stronger than before, and it's easy for them to advance in many areas. And in the last just 3 months, we found so many actually advancement done by the Houthis in area close to Saudi Yemeni borders, specifically in Al-Jawf, Ma'arib, and now in Al-Bayda. Yes.
Yes. Well, let's soon get to some questions that some of our participants and viewers have this afternoon. We might just, is Rafat still not connected?
He is correct. Yeah, he's still dropped off, unfortunately.
Okay, well, I think he was going to help us talk a little bit more about the specifics of UN envoy Martin Griffiths' proposals and precisely what the responses of some of the different actors have been, as we've been essentially agreeing today that peace has gone backward, not forward, despite this increased UN intervention, both from New York and locally from the envoy and his staff. But we also hear rumors, and we were hoping Rafat could illuminate this a little bit, that the Houthis have been responding to these proposals, and that was progress that Griffiths felt he had in his hands that he could take to the Security Council in New York to brief the Secretary General of the Security Council. So it does seem that we have multiple steps forward and backward simultaneously. And we're going to continue to essentially keep our eyes on a variety of moving elements in this theater, from conflict to human rights to aid provision. But let's take a comment, Osama. This question could be for you. With regard to humanitarian aid, is it caused more by local citizens' disapproval of impartial aid, organizations, or is it more the incapacity of these organizations to act and provide aid under conflict conditions?
It's caused by the behavior of the warring parties to the conflict on the ground. The warring parties have impacted negatively the humanitarian access in the country through different ways. So, for instance, they could confiscate humanitarian aid in security checkpoints. They could attack the humanitarian aid workers. They might intervene in the process of distributing the humanitarian aid. So it's not the issue of the humanitarian organizations, as it is more on the how the warring parties dealing with the humanitarian aid, and if they are respecting the principles of international humanitarian law and humanitarian work in the country.
Alyssa, could you take the next, or ask the next question? I've lost access.
That was the last question that I had, Jeff.
Okay, I guess we're having some challenges seeing all the comments. Well, what do you, Osama, Ahmed, Ahmed, this question for you to help us move towards, in the remaining time that we have, what do we expect to happen as COVID cases are going up and with aid being weaponized now, but the UN at the same time is fully engaged and believes that it has progress in its hands? What can we expect in the coming weeks in Yemen?
I think since we have this kind of stubbornity among the local actors as well as the external actors to finish many businesses related to their conflict in Yemen, I think the conflict will continue. And the optimism that the UN envoy is talking about, I'm not sure if it's realistic or not, because he is talking about ceasefire, then started peace talks among the warring parties. but in fact, they are not ready. And this is not just, I mean, the perspective of journalists and analysts who are following the Yemeni situation, but also even the grassroots feel that there is no optimism, there is no horizon that the warring parties will move towards peace talks. And in this matter, let me just mention Riyadh Agreement, because Riyadh Agreement, many people were so optimistic about it, because the two parties who signed the Riyadh Agreement were under the leadership of the coalition. I'm talking about the STC and the Hadi, the internationally recognized government. And even the process of the agreement was with the time frame, and they were talking about specific steps. But unfortunately, after almost 5 months of Riyadh Agreement, we have seen nothing on the ground. And in fact, this is related to the contradictory strategies among the external actors, among the Emiratis and Saudis, who are trying actually to work from behind the scene. And we cannot trust the words that we are hearing from some external actors saying that we are supporting the peace in Yemen, while they are using the local factions to advance their agenda. This is actually one of the key issues that we are suffering. So the conflict will continue. The number of COVID-19 expected also to rise in upcoming days. And this is actually the one of the worst scenario we are witnessing in Yemen nowadays.
I would like to add here that in Yemen, what we lack is the accountability for accountability and justice for human rights violations. And what we expect in the coming period, that the international community should support the efforts for accountability. And also we call on the states and UN member states to support the work of the group of eminent experts that was established in 2017 to document the human rights violations committed by all parties to the conflict. And it's essential to support the UN group of eminence because it's currently the only international mechanism that we have in Yemen for accountability.
Very good. Well, we're getting close to, I think we've got some technical difficulties. Alyssa, could you take us home?
I'm sorry?
Could you just end, because I've got some echo here.
Okay. And on what?
Just thank everyone and bring it to a close today.
Thank you everyone for your time and for joining us today. Please visit us at nycfpa.org for any further information, or you can email us at info@nycfpa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.